What is a good life for you?
For me, it's really clear now, which is I'm able to be like present with my daughter. And I remember years ago, I listened to this podcast episode with Tim Ferriss and Josh Waitzkin, and Josh Waitzkin wrote a gorgeous book called The Art of Learning because he'd become a world champion in chess and in slow hands, a bit of martial arts technique. And in this interview with Tim Ferriss, it's probably the most moving thing I've ever heard someone say because he's a high achiever, has become a world champion, Olympic champion in two areas, and yet the way he spoke about being being a dad, I found the most moving thing I've ever heard. And I've spent a lot of my life focused on how ultimately we find our gifts and contribute those gifts in our communities and to volunteering and to ultimately how do we alleviate suffering in the world, unnecessary suffering. And since becoming a dad, I'm convinced that if we want to truly build a better world, if we just focus on being great parents, we probably would have far less tyranny and exploitation and suffering because I think ultimately that type of, let's call it negative behaviors or negative leadership, come from people that aren't aware and are perhaps got pent up anger or whatever it might be. And the thing I've learned in becoming a parent is that like if kids can be raised well, which means they're seen, they're not shamed, they're given good boundaries, healthy boundaries, and they're loved, and they experience no violence or ill treatment, we would probably see our society truly transform. And I guess in some ways links to our conversation, which is we're putting all these attachments on young people, and we've seen through good intentions but bad ideas. To quote a phrase from Jonathan Haidt in his book, like the latest generation of young people with they're the most anxious, depressed, medicated of any generation, which is tragic. And but at the same time, I think they're the most aware, perhaps environmentally, socially conscious. And so I think every generation has its own challenge. But to me, if I'm a present dad, which means I'm really there for my daughter and I can be a great parent to her, then I know I'm probably getting the rest of my life right. And so to me, a good life is being present for my daughter. And I think actually that comes from, and not trying to sell the story I've been telling here, I think a good life is actually being unattached from pretty much everything else, which I think in some ways would be unhealthy for me.